Hi, welcome to Canton Community Television. My name is Tanya Willow, and we're very honored today to have a guest, Neville Frankel, who is a historical novelist and who has written 3 very important books, the latest of which is The Sickle's Edge. Neville, thank you so much for coming to Canton Community TV and traveling down here. It's an honor for us to have you in the studio.
It's a pleasure to be here. My second time.
Yeah, your second time. The first book was Bloodlines that you came and talked about, and this one was just launched in January, so congratulations.
Thank you.
And congratulations on your launch at the Boston Public Library. That was very exciting.
Oh, thanks. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was great. And we have some similar things coming up at the Canton Library on April 20th. We're going to show some music from Russia, and we'll show why that's relevant. So before we go off, Neville, why don't you tell us a little bit about the plot of the book that you've written, the latest one?
Well, the plot is based on loosely on my family's history. And it covers 5 generations from South Africa through Latvia to the Soviet Union. It has to do with the part of my family that was lost just before the First World War, when they went back to Russia from South Africa and got trapped there. As I say, it follows 5 generations of a family through the Russian Revolution, the First World War, the Stalinist era, the repressions and difficulties that people went through living in the Soviet Union, and the ultimate reunification of the family in the 1960s.
Yeah, there's a lot in this book, in many levels, not just the specifics of the plot, but we learn about what it is to be human and when people are subjugated to political structures. And that seems to be the themes of your historical novels. All 3 of them seem to show a regime or a policy that affects individuals and how their lives are affected by whatever political structure they're under.
Well, I find myself fascinated by the way people are affected by geopolitical events much bigger than they are. I didn't realize this when I began writing. I thought, you know, I'm a storyteller and I'm involved with the people in my stories. But it turns out that I've written 3 novels, one about Zimbabwe, which became Rhodesia, Rhodesia, which became Zimbabwe, one about South Africa, post and pre and post apartheid, and one that takes place in the Soviet Union, which also died. So there are 3 totalitarian countries that had the opportunity to become strong democratic bastions, and in all 3 cases, they seem to have failed.
You're not writing about the United States next, are you?
No, I'm not. But I made a joke somewhere that if you want to visit Argentina or Bolivia and you haven't yet, you better do it before I write the story.
Oh, that's
because
right.
The lights are going to go out.
In this book, though, and we talk about plot, there's kind of a thriller element to it, but there's also a lot of wisdom contained in this book. And that was the piece that I was fascinated by. And as I mentioned before the camera started rolling, I said there are elements of this book that are as good as any book I've ever read. So there are very powerful pieces that come through. So I'd like to just hit a little bit on your process. Do you tell these characters that you write the wisdom that you have and bestow that upon them, or do they give you the wisdom that they seem to contain?
That's a great question. I don't think I have a lot of wisdom. What happens in my writing process is that I write in the first person. So this book, On the Sickle's Edge, is written in the voices of 4 people. And they speak through me. So I'm speaking from inside their heads. And the experience for me is an extraordinary one because it allows me to live other people's lives. Someone asked me recently whether I plot my novels from beginning to end, and the answer is no. I sort of let them. I know where I want to begin, and I know where I need to end. But what happens in the middle, I allow my characters to kind of direct. And so what they do and what they say and how they feel comes through me.
The women characters in this book, though, are extraordinary and very convincing. So when you write in the first person about women, the empathy level and the ability for you to let me feel like I'm listening to the voice of a woman's voice is incredibly well done. And there's very powerful elements of it, especially the 2 main female characters that seem to have a lot going for them. I'd like to just, if I could, and I'm loosely quoting, but I would like to ask you where these thoughts came from and how you arrived at them. One of them, at one point of the book, he writes along these lines, and again, I'm just loosely quoting. It said, "Activities were to turn children into stalwart communists. We lived in a deep hole, and somehow people convinced themselves that we live with sunshine on our faces." I read that, and I was terrified a little bit, because it seems to be the human way that we cope with structures larger than ourselves that are devastating our personal lives. So I was wondering where that came from, and if you noticed it as a pattern under regimes, that people just pretend it's not as bad as it actually is.
I don't know where it came from. One of my characters spouted it through my pen, but it's pretty clear to me from what I've read and what I've seen and what I've observed is that no matter where people live, they somehow manage to survive. Mm-hmm. They find joy in small things. Mm-hmm. They take joy and hope wherever they can. And so we look back on the Soviet Union and the deprivations that they suffered and the fear that they lived with, and somehow life went on. Mm. I think that happens in every regime, everywhere. When you look at my previous book, Bloodlines, and what took place under apartheid.
Yes.
Black South Africans lived lives that were just extraordinarily difficult. They were dehumanized in so many different ways, and somehow they found ways to live, to love, to have children, to dance. They rejoiced in food. People find ways to survive and to hope and to move forward.
And that's sort of the structure of this book, and I think too the Bloodlines as well, is that you have a large event taking place, and then how it impacts these individuals. And I was unable to find it, but when I read it, it was striking for me too. Something along the lines of how people try to survive these structures, and how petty tyrants sort of just destroy people's lives, not necessarily coming from the very top, but low-lying individuals can really destroy the lives of everyday people.
Well, one of the things that was at the base of my desire to write this book is that I had these family stories passed down to me about what happened to my family. And the irony is that I didn't know my ancestors. They became these mythic figures who made huge changes in their lives in order to better their futures. And I wondered, in difficult situations like in the Soviet Union, which ones of them had the character to become heroes in their own lives? Mm. Which ones of them were weak and failed? Mm. And one never knows which characters are going to be the ones who survive, who make lives better for the people around them, or who become petty tyrants and exert a negative influence on people around them.
Well, you've got a character named Gregory in this book here, and he's sort of a petty tyrant. But what is amazing for me about that particular character is that I think a lot of times people think in terms of tyranny affecting only the most vulnerable. But I think your book sort of displays to us that even the very powerful are destroyed by tyranny. That, in other words, there's no safe place to be under this type of regime, or there's no safe place to be when we live under these kinds of systems, because everybody's affected, regardless of whether they're on a very small person or a person with a lot of power.
Well, I've learned some things as I've written these books, and one of the most cogent things I heard from anybody when I wrote Bloodlines, the previous book, applies to this book as well. It was a psychologist who said, if you live under a repressive regime, then you somehow fall on a spectrum between being a perpetrator and a victim. And you can never get off that spectrum. You can move a little in one direction or another, but you are always on the spectrum. And if you're a perpetrator, if you are someone who does evil things, it affects everybody. Mm-hmm. And everybody is a victim. And
everybody includes yourself.
Yes.
So even if you're a perpetrator, you're not freeing yourself from being a victim.
That's correct.
You're a victim of your own actions.
That's correct.
And that was very well said within this book, because it's not done in a sort of contrived way. It's done in a very powerful way. And so the book just really took me through, and watching these characters go through what they went through. The other thing that I loved, and I think it's, is it Daria, how do you say Daria's name?
Daria.
Daria's name. She says, I was too young to know that wisdom comes to us uneven in bursts and at random order. And I read that and I thought, isn't that the truth? That wisdom comes to us in random order. And she goes on to say, because she marries this person very young and is sexually attracted to him and he has power, but she doesn't realize the consequences of all this. She said, my life was both impossibly difficult and horribly normal. And there are points in this book where I just kind of underline these pieces that just stop you in your tracks. And you have to very much think about how true these statements are. So when you write a piece like that, when you come across something like that that's powerful, do you know it or do you just go on to the next line and not fully absorbing what it is that you've just said that may have such a powerful thing? Or is that too distracting to get lost in that kind of point in your book?
Well, when I'm in somebody else's head and they're speaking through me, it sounds a little hokey, you know, and I don't really believe that one can channel anything. But when I'm doing this, I'm actually channeling somebody.
Yeah.
Because I can't speak the way Daria speaks. I can't speak the way Lena, her grandmother, who was an old woman, speaks. I've never been an old woman.
Sure.
But somehow, when she comes through me, her voice is genuine.
Yeah. It was genuine, and that was the other piece too. Is that they definitely do have this sense. Just we mentioned it off air before we started, but Norman Mailer wrote this book called The Spooky Art, and it talks about that kind of channeling. It really is an amazing piece. I don't know this book's a little, I don't know if dark is the right word, but there are scarier pieces to this book. I thought some of the actions that Gregory takes, and I'm not going to spoil anybody's reading of it, the things that he does. But there's a point where he comes into a room and I'm just loosely quoting. It says, Gregory came into the front door. At the sound of his feet approaching, the warm light energy in the room suddenly darkened and became cool and thick. And I don't know if other people have had that experience, but if you've ever been around somebody with a bit of a sociopathic tendency, sometimes who have revealed themselves to you at this point where they no longer have anything to hide and their game is sort of up, but they're still in your life. It seems like they literally changed the physiology of the room. And is that something that you've been in touch with personally, or is this something more that you was like just feeling what they would feel if this character came in the room?
Well, I think everybody has an energy around them. And when anybody comes into a room, they change it in one way or another. Yes. And we all know that some people have more energy than others. Yes. We know that some people suck the energy out of a room, and other people sort of energize the whole group when they come in.
Sure.
And this sort of dark energy is I don't know whether I've ever experienced it personally, but I could imagine what it's like.
Well, it was amazing because, of course, she's with her grandmother at that point, and they're having a great, like, women amongst each other, enjoying each other in ways that, until I read your book, I thought it was a secret that men didn't know that we women had these joyful moments. And then Gregory comes into the room and he robs that from them, and and this is what the book does. It just moves on from one very profound element to the next. It just seems to really move.
You know, it's interesting you talk about the darkness. I didn't realize this was such a dark book. I thought as I was writing it that it was a book filled with hope and generosity and the way that people manage to cope in difficult situations and courage. But I guess those things don't really come through unless you have something to oppose them.
Right.
So you have to have the darkness and the difficulty in order to see how people cope with it.
Yes, I don't know that describing the book as dark is correct, but there are pieces in it that just are so powerful and shows you how some of these people try to overcome what they're put up against.
Well, you know, part of the research that I had to do was not just talking to people who lived under the Soviet Union, but doing a lot of reading. And when you recognize how terrifying Stalin was and what he did to his own people, how people just disappeared off the street, how you could be sent to the Gulag, to Siberia, for using as toilet paper a piece of newspaper that had Stalin's face on it. These were terrible times to live in.
Yes, and arbitrary punishments.
And very arbitrary, yes,
yeah.
yeah. And Stalin was sick. Stalin was mentally ill, and paranoid, and people just disappeared around him.
And yet it didn't keep him from rising to power, which is another kind of frightening element. I'd like to talk a little bit about the picture in the story and how painting was a sort of escape for one of your main characters, a place to look at the picture. I'm curious how that came about. I know that you did some research to find a painting, but why did you choose that as a way of sort of a central way of getting to a character?
Well, it's actually a wonderful story, and what's fascinating about it for me is how important serendipity is in writing. So I have a character whose name is Lena, and as a little girl, she comes from a small village in Latvia into Moscow, and she's lost more than any little girl should ever have to lose. She's lost her mother, she's lost her home, she's lost brothers. For reasons that become apparent if you read the book, she's not able to practice her religion. And when she gets to Moscow, her stepmother looks at her and says, this little girl is failing. She's just failing to thrive. She's dying. And she says, I'm going to take her to the library. And I'm going to show her something about beauty, pictures and poems and stories, and maybe give her a sense of purpose. And the writer in me said, wait a minute, this is a historical novel. I have to find out whether there actually was a library in Moscow available to the citizens after the revolution. So I began to do some research, and I discovered that in the mid-1800s, a very wealthy duke donated his library and his paintings to the people of the city of Moscow. And when he did that, and the building was established to house his collection, the Tsar donated a painting to the library. Can I hold this up?
Go right ahead.
So this is part of the painting. And it's a painting done by Alexander Ivanov called Christ Appears Before the People. It actually is a much larger painting, but it didn't fit, so we had to cut it off. And I looked at this picture, and I knew that my character would have to walk through the vestibule of the library, you know, of the museum to get to the library. And there was this painting. The painting is 24 feet by 18. It's huge. It's a gorgeous painting of John the Baptist baptizing Jews coming out of the Jordan River. And in the background is this beatific figure of Jesus Christ dressed in a blue robe. And all the characters in the painting are looking at Christ. And I shivered when I saw the painting because I knew that my character, this little teenage girl who came from a small village, who'd never seen a painting, who'd never seen a naked body, who had had all these losses, I knew that she would look at this painting and be just transfixed. And I knew that it had to become part of the story, and it did. So it becomes an icon in her life, and she keeps coming back to it as a way of giving herself location and power and purpose and contact with something beautiful.
It's actually, it goes from her being very young and experiencing so much more loss after her initial losses, and yet she can return to the painting and can even bring new family members to look at it with her. So it's a fabulous scene. The painting just plays a fabulous role, and you do discuss elements in the painting that wasn't included in that particular cover, but the web is a wonderful thing. So when you're reading the book, you could just go right and look it up, and there's enough references to it in the book that you could actually find it and look at it and say, this is what she's looking at.
But I think this is important because it comes back to what you asked me previously about how people manage to live. People find beauty wherever they are.
They do.
Because they have to. If you can't find hope and optimism and reason to move on, then you may as well just lie down and die. And people don't do that.
Well, tyranny is never enough to suppress everyone, that's for sure. And one of the things that seems to be changing a little bit. I was listening to a program on the way down here by Christopher Lydon, who shows a show, and he had this thing on Russia. And he was talking about how they're sort of people are retreating to their individualism. So one of the consequences, though, of having a larger system that doesn't work, when your government doesn't work, is that people do tend to retreat to very smaller and smaller levels. And in your case, the characters had to retreat to the point where they had to give up their religion so they wouldn't, because there was a decision made that this is the best way for us to survive as a group. Can you talk about it all, how that sacrifice may have been something that worked on having your characters lose a piece of who they were and had to sort of reconstruct it, and even in the reconstruction maybe not ever quite get themselves fully back as a result of being under a regime that may not accept what religion they had?
Well, these were a Jewish family who discovered or recognized or came to the conclusion that the difficulties that they'd had over the last generations had to do with the fact that they were Jews in the Russian Empire, and they decided to deny their heritage. There are times all through history when that's happened, to Jews as well as to other people. But very often, when you try and give up something that's a part of you, it doesn't work very well. And some shadow of who you really are and who your family is follows you through the generations. And that's what happened here. They couldn't actually give it up completely, and eventually it sort of comes back into the picture.
Right. And it's, in the way you handle this brilliantly. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit just about also a physical piece in the book, where we talk about a hidden, I don't know what you would call it, but a piece of their past with the teapots that they were able to reconstruct themselves through a physical object, and yet it's almost like a mysterious thing that someone found, like an old bone dug up or something, where it's really difficult.
It's an old teapot that was made by one of their ancestors, which contains within it many of the symbols of Jewish tradition and Jewish ritual. And despite the fact that they gave up their religion, somehow they couldn't give up the teapot. They had to retain hold of it in some way. And it's a symbol of the brokenness of their lives, because the teapot is actually divided into two pieces and then ultimately comes together in the same way as I would like to think their lives did as well. But it's very hard to relinquish a part of one's identity completely. But if you don't relinquish it completely, then it comes back to hit you in the behind.
Right, right.
Which here it did.
And how does that relate to your own personal experience, as far as you were uncovering your own life, and the book is loosely based on what you discovered about your own personal background? Did writing this book kind of, in a fictional way, bring things to closure for you, or help you through those mystery of not knowing who those people were and what their experiences were?
I think they did. You know, I grew up going shopping with my grandparents, which I think I've mentioned to you. And we would go shopping every month and buy dozens of belts and leather gloves and things, and wrap them up in brown paper and send them off to our family in Moscow. And I didn't understand where Moscow was, or why we had family there, or why we were sending them stuff. But it turned out that this is two branches of the family who were separated when my great-grandparents left South Africa with some of their children to find a new wife after my great-grandmother died, and never came back. And so the family was separated until the 1960s, when the Red Cross helped to reunite them. And my great-uncle went to Moscow and said, my goodness, the conditions in which we find our family living are terrible. Let's see if we can help them. So I grew up with a sense that there were these people who needed assistance, and learned about the history of my family going back several generations. And I think the family story has been really important in forming who I am, who I think it's possible to be. And one of the conclusions I've come to as a result of all this is that family stories are extraordinarily important in defining how we think about ourselves and what we think we can become, and very often enable us to become much more than we think we can, simply based upon our own little circumstances. We are bigger than, the lives we live today.
When your characters rediscover their religion and kind of get a sense of piecing it back together again, do you think that's a process that happened for them, that they sort of say, I can be bigger than this, like they had a connectedness that they were maybe cut off from, and now that they have that background, they feel like they're connected to a past that kind of empowers them in some way?
Well, I think it was more complicated than that. I think it was almost the opposite of that, because here you have one of the characters who is a diehard communist, who wants to rise through the ranks to help her people. And when she discovers that she's not who she thinks she is, she's not made of Mother Russia. She's a Jew. All of a sudden, she has to begin thinking about the Jews around her who are treated badly, who are denied access to universities or training or jobs, and to think about them differently. It's not just them, now it's us. And so that changes the way that she thinks about herself and about her life. Not necessarily in a positive way, because it reduces her chances of advancement, but it makes her more human.
She also loses and isn't trusted by her own family as a consequence of her loyalty to
her husband.
And yet she isn't fully loyal to him. Her ideas are quite different than his. And she pays a terrible price because she's embraced by no one. She is sort of, in order to take a political stand almost, whether it be in her own head or not, fully working for those who think that she's allied with him, although I suspect her husband doesn't fully trust her. She's almost completely isolated as a result. What is isolation, do you think, as far as the politics of being someone who stands by their ideals and the price that you pay for doing that? And we can talk a little bit broader on the idea of a historical novelist who has to sort of live in these current times. And some of the things that you needed to do is your own expression in writings, say in the Huffington Post, as we talked about, and how that can sometimes, by taking a stand on something, alienate you from what your allies in a way.
Do you think she stood by her? I'm turning the table here. Do you think she stood by her beliefs, or did she betray them?
I think that she had beliefs that betrayed her, in a sense, and that she had to adjust to that.
A number of people who've read this book are very angry with her as a character, because despite the fact that she had good impulses and a desire to do good in the world, she actually ended up betraying a lot of people, betraying her values, putting people in danger, her people she loved in danger. But she's a complex woman who found herself at a very young age involved with somebody who she was way more complex and way more devious than she could even begin to deal with.
It's so funny. I didn't feel that way about her at all.
Oh, that's interesting.
I really didn't. I just felt that she was a victim of her not a victim really, but caught up in her time, in her youth, and made decisions that were pretty permanent and very difficult to overcome. But I have to say, her grandmother was my favorite because she was the one that really was able to navigate the situations better than anyone, I think, as far as in the book. But no, I didn't hate anyone. Maybe Gregory was a little tough, but but I thought that everybody just sort of, and that's what I love about this book. It wasn't as simple as all that. You know, there's not like a good guy versus a bad guy, and this person does all these wonderful things, and this other person does
Nobody
all these
is all good or bad. Everybody is mixed, and it's the way that things work together when people are put into the same room or the same circumstance. You never know really who's going to do what.
And I think it's the complexity of your characters that made me love this book.
Well,
that
thank you.
It's not a simple book. It's a book that really, you read it and you may feel different ways. Now, I talked about how I loved the women characters because I thought they were written very, very well. But off camera, we had that it was said that your book has done very well with men, middle-aged men who cried. What was it that the men found profound in this book?
Well, if you talk to people in publishing today, they'll tell you that most novels are read by women. And when I go around talking to book groups, I have never been to a men's book group.
No, that's a good point.
Okay, they're all women. But men are reading this book, and they're touched by something in it, and I don't really know what it is. It may be the powerful women that I seem able to write. I'm pretty sure that it's women who have been behind civilization since the beginning. The power of women and the feminine in our lives and in society, I think, is what drives it. But somehow I've been able to touch people with a story in a way that's very gratifying to me.
Yeah.
I thought I was just telling a story about my family. Apparently I've been telling a story about everybody's family. As a matter of fact, I thought that this was a story about European immigrants. I spoke to a Chinese man last week we were talking about the book, and he said, you know, this isn't just a story about Europe. He said, my grandfather left China in 1949. He went to Taiwan. And he got stuck there when the communist Chinese took over.
Oh, sure.
And his family was separated for 40 years. So, you know, this whole idea of being affected by geopolitical events that are so much bigger than we are doesn't just happen to one group. It happens to everybody, and it's a historical pattern that keeps happening, and somehow the human race doesn't learn from history.
Just to speak of that just briefly, you spoke about, we're having that experience a little bit here in the United States with this, suddenly we're kind of causing immigrants to be the group that we're kind of focusing on and holding as the enemy. And then one of the things that you recently wrote is about nursing homes, because you're dealing with nursing homes right now and how that affects different people. How do you write about current issues, given what you've learned about history, being an historical novelist, and at the same time try not to maybe alienate a potential reader, or in the social media world that we live in, everybody knows all about us, so it's kind of hard to almost anonymously write a book and have that be, the writer be a separate person from your individual feelings or your individual politics. Has you found that to be an increased problem now that we have large social media? Is that difficult waters to walk, or how do you do that? How do you navigate that?
That's actually a great question, and it's one that I deal with and I struggle with quite a lot. I never intended to be a political writer, and I didn't intend to write political books. But it turns out that that's what I've done. And having written now 3 books that have to do with the way that people navigate political difficulties and the way that huge events affect their lives, it's very difficult not to come to some conclusions about what's happening in the world and in the country, and to feel them rather deeply. And if I feel them deeply, I have to be willing to put them out there. So I feel, for example, very deeply that people should be talking to each other in this country. That whether you voted or didn't vote for the current president, it's very important to talk to people who have different viewpoints. And I've encountered people on both sides of the political spectrum who either don't want to talk to the other side, don't think the other side can be talked to, and I think that's very destructive, and I think it's very short-sighted. So when I find people who are able to cross those lines, I like to publicize what they've done, which is what I'm doing.
Yeah, and you've got a little bit of trouble for that, or not everyone is
well, not everybody's happy. Not everybody's, but that's okay. You know,
that's right. You're willing.
If you write anything, you have to be willing to deal with praise as well as with its opposite.
For another reason, I researched John F. Kennedy wrote an obituary or spoke before a group, and one of the things he said is that the poet's job is never an easy one, because the poet's job is to expose the normal things that we accept as being okay, sort of the way that you describe people having their face as if their face was to the sun when it really isn't going on, and that
right.
Nobody likes to be told that their perspectives and even their country or whatever it is they attach themselves to may be less than perfect. So the poet's job is a difficult job. And you, Neville, are a fantastic poet. And I think that this novel is fabulous. And I want to congratulate you. What a great job you did with it. And I'm looking forward to your next one, because I really enjoy what you write.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, and we're looking forward to, we'll be on at the Canton Public Library. Can you tell a little bit about the person that's going to be appearing there with you? Is not just going to be yourself, but you're also going to have a little bit of music going on.
Well, her name is Abigail Reisman, and she is a wonderful klezmer violinist. A young woman, very talented, who will talk about the role of music and klezmer in Eastern Europe.
And the different songs that would be done at Jewish weddings at that time, and
right.
at the end and the beginning of the ceremonies.
That's right.
I saw her at the Boston Public Library, and she was just so energetic. Talk about someone who changes a room.
That's right. That's right.
And that's one of the things that you seem to surround yourself with, is people who change the room in a positive way. So it's
well,
fabulous to be around. So it's been great.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
It's been very much of a pleasure talking to you as well.